Hi, and welcome back to Football Made Simple.
The transfer window is shut, and several of Chelsea's January signings took to the field in their 0-0 draw with Fulham. In this video, we'll focus on how Potter used the new signings within his team's tactical structure and what allowed some of them to thrive whilst others weren't allowed to be at their best. Without further ado, let's dig in. And a lot of you have been asking what software I use for my analysis, and it's called Once Video Analyzer Pro. And it's already pretty affordable, but I've teamed up with them to give any of you who want to try it a further 10% off by using the code FMS10. So visit their website through the link in the description below if you're interested. The new signings we'll be focusing on are Mudryk, Mudryk, Badiashile and Fernandez in that order. So let's begin with the wide men. For the most part, Mudryk looked great when he came on for Mudryk in the second half. And of course, individual performance plays a huge role, but Potter's first half tactics may not have helped Mudryk. In general, Fulham defended in either a 4-4-1-1 or a 4-4-2, with a big focus being on preventing the ball into Fernandez and generally protecting the centre of the pitch. And this was aided by the wingers also tucking in fairly narrow during this phase. These narrow wingers would help to prevent the ball into the higher free eights in Mount and Gallagher, and Fulham were happy for the ball to begin wider. So with the back four, you can see that Fulham now have a midfield four with the wingers fairly narrow, whilst Pereira and Mitrovic in this case have shifted into a front two, the main goal being to prevent the ball into Fernandez. So the easier options for Chelsea are in the wide regions. And in the first half, Potter's use of his fullbacks was interesting, as both tended to stay wide and fairly deep on the pitch to begin with, so that the shape looked like this 2-3-2-3. But this also led to problems, as when Fulham were pressing and the ball did go wider to a deep fullback, the winger could then spring from a more central position to press the fullback. And because initially Cucurella were in the same vertical line, the passing lane could be cut out fairly easily. Alternatively, when Mudryk did drop deep to receive the ball, Tete only had one man to concern himself with, so he could drop deep with him fairly comfortably, forcing him to play backwards for the most part. And this is not ideal for Mudryk, as he prefers to receive on the half turn so he can take on his man, which we rarely saw in this game. Again, Fulham are narrow with their 4-4-2, the easy pass is out wide, but as soon as Cucurella receives, Reed is out to press him, and we can see Mudryk is facing backwards to receive and can be tracked more easily. And run it on and we have a similar situation once again. Add to this that when Chelsea did get higher up the pitch, Cucurella tended to push high up early on during the play, and this would mean rather than stay wide in a potential 1v1 situation, Mudryk would have to come narrower into the half space, often with Mount either dropping in so that Chelsea had this diamond front four, or at times rotating into the deeper vacated position. But either way, Mudryk would be in a more crowded half space where he couldn't make the most use of his dribbling ability. In addition, with Fulham being fairly deep, it would be difficult to release Mudryk and use his pace in behind, as there wasn't much space for the through ball. So initially, Cucurella and Mudryk are in the same vertical line, and Mudryk is easily picked up. As the ball advances, Cucurella pushes higher up, meaning that Mudryk now has to come into the central area rather than receive for the 1v1. Mudryk's best situations came on the transition, where there was space in behind for him to attack either centrally or down the wing. Down the right hand side, we saw similar dynamics between Ziyech and James, often occupying the same vertical room. But James was much later to overlap, allowing Ziyech to initially receive so that he could then look to create the 2 versus 1. In addition, Ziyech is more of a creative winger, so he is much more comfortable tucking into these central regions, allowing James to go wide, where Ziyech could then potentially look for a cross, whereas Mudryk prefers to take on his man rather than create in these zones. But in the second half, Potter made a slight tactical tweak that helped Mudryk. So before where both fullbacks had started wide, now early on in the second, Cucurella was much more likely to invert alongside Fernandez, and Reed, rather than stay wide, would often be drawn towards him. So now Chelsea often had more of a midfield box, with Havertz often being willing to drop deeper as well. More importantly, with Cucurella having drawn in the winger, it meant that Mudryk was much more likely to have these 1v1s, whether this was by a direct pass or a switch after Fulham had been drawn to one side of the pitch. and this allowed him to be more expressive and look more dangerous when he was on the left-hand side. So Cucurella is alongside Fernandez in the midfield. Reed has been drawn in, so the passing lane is potentially open to Mudryk, although he's not found in this particular situation. In this case, Mudryk and Sterling have actually rotated, but the principle is similar, where Cucurella, being central, draws in the winger, so now the potential to find Sterling is on, and he's momentarily in a 1v1, which Mudryk rarely had in the first half. So that was just a slight difference between the two wingers in this one match, but Badiashile making his third appearance and Fernandez on debut were both impressive, and in fact, the interaction between them was also interesting. If Fernandez being the most expensive Premier League player of all time wasn't a big enough hint, this match made it clear that he's going to be trusted and handed a big responsibility by Potter. As we've seen with many sides who are performing well, such as City and Arsenal, there is a lot of onus on the defensive midfielder when in possession, and Fernandez played a similar role in this match, staying deep, whilst Mount and Gallagher both pushed much higher up the pitch, often leaving him somewhat isolated. So this is a midfield shape that we'll see quite a lot, with the free eights pushing much higher up, leaving Fernandez to do almost all of the progression. So basically any central play for Chelsea had to come through Fernandez, who did see a lot of the ball. But as discussed, Fulham were concentrated on cutting him off as much as they could, either using their cover shadows in the front two or directly man marking with the 4-4-1-1. Chelsea did look to try and solve this problem, firstly as both Gallagher and Mount could drop deeper in phases, looked to assist Fernandez with the progression, and Fernandez was great at receiving under pressure and making the right decision on when to play backwards to the fullbacks or at times to his fellow midfielder. The man who dropped would then often draw one of the Fulham pivots higher, and Fernandez would be comfortable enough to play the return ball into the space created on a couple of occasions. So here Fulham temporarily have a front two, and Mount drops deep, receive the ball off of Badiashile and play it to Fernandez. This creates a small gap in the midfield that Fernandez looks to play the return into, but it is intercepted. But what is promising is that despite Fulham clearly looking to cut Fernandez out of the game, he was brave enough to look for the ball as much as possible, and this could involve dropping deep, particularly when Fulham did look to press in their 4-4-2 and the front two applying pressure on the centre backs. Fernandez would recognise the right moment to drop in to create a 3 versus 2 so that there was no longer that man-to-man pressure. This would also give the fullbacks more license to push higher up the pitch. And perhaps more importantly, Fernandez's passing range was outstanding and bodes well for the future, as whenever he did drop deep, whether into the back four or even as just a regular midfielder, he possessed the ability to take out Fulham's whole midfield with one line-breaking pass, allowing Chelsea to be attacking the back four. So here Fernandez has a rare moment of space and immediately drops deep to pick up the ball. He is then able to break the first line and find Gallagher, which means Chelsea are now past the Fulham midfield for once. Here we see an alternate situation where once again he drops into the back three. And now, having maintained the 3 versus 2, Herrera was first drawn to Badiashile, giving Fernandez a bit more room to look for the ambitious switch. And he finds James. But perhaps most importantly, when it did look like he might be marked out of the game and he couldn't get on the ball, he still found ways to be effective, and that was through his movement. If he had stayed stationary, Fulham could enact a pretty standard piston pressing shape, where, depending on the side of the ball, one forward would press and the other one would then look to drop onto Fernandez. But what we often saw instead is that when the ball went wide and Mitrovic looked to press, Fernandez would come wide as well, as firstly, this would mean he was a potential option, but more likely, because Fulham were using that piston press, Herrera would follow Fernandez into this wider region. And this would now allow Badiashile to receive with space ahead of him, and he was very impressive as he could drive into the space. And with this space, we saw that he was capable of going for more ambitious switches, but at the same time was able to break the line as well when needed. So here Fernandez is deeper and he'll draw Pereira, giving Badiashile the room to play the switch. But here we see it more clearly, as Mitrovic will look to press Silva and Pereira will drop onto Fernandez, who is moving wider. This then opens up the space into Badiashile. Now he had the option to go wide to the winger, but instead he opts to break the line to find Mount, leading to a promising situation. But it should also be mentioned that Fernandez was great in the defensive phase, whether this was marshalling the space in behind his fellow midfielders, as he put up 6 tackles during this match. But on the occasions where Mudryk did get drawn out to pressing the fullback and Reed was pushing higher, the Fulham midfielder would often move into the wide region to look to receive, but Fernandez was always quick to cover across. Overall, this is just one match and is not a judgment of any of these players, but it will be interesting to see what their tactical role will look like as the season progresses. Let me know if you're interested in seeing more of these player-focused videos, as this is a different kind of video for me. But what do you think of these players, and how do you see their roles evolving? If you enjoyed this, you'll love our full breakdown of Potter's tactics this season, linked in the cards now.
I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, you might enjoy the content available on my Patreon. Not only does Patreon help to support the continued production of content, as I am a one-man team, but it also gives you early access to videos that will come on the channel. You'll also get exclusive videos, get to vote on polls, and so much more. And it's cheaper than ever, no longer having a tier system, so everyone on the Patreon gets access to all the content. So head over to patreon.com/footballmadesimple to check it out.
And a big thanks to my latest patrons, including Lau Tiong Yi, Dogba Base, James Lang, Ahmed Assad, Rodrigo Martinez, Ak for Ballon d'Or, and Ralph Monty Falcon.